let's go, I guess.
Hi,
Thanks.
Christa.
Thanks. Hi, Andrea. Thanks for joining. You and I have met a couple of times just on like Twitter and engaged through the socials. You invited me to a Toastmasters, an astrological Toastmasters event.
Sure,
Many,
Kepler
hmm
Astrologers Toastmasters, which is
yeah,
associated with Kepler College.
yeah. That was an excellent event. It's been a while, but I guess through just the magic of social media, I feel like I know you. It's easy to pick up a conversation with you. Maybe that's just a testimony of who you are. You are a person that wears many hats or maybe makes many hats. Do you want to tell everybody just kind of what you do? I have a list of things, and it's a nice um, kind of diverse patchwork quilt of a lot of really fun things, but I like to hear it um, from the people themselves.
Sure, I started blogging in 2002 or so as a poet.
Mhm.
I've been a poet now for a very, very long time. I think I started working on poetry in 1998. I just recently had my 25th anniversary as a poet.
Nice.
And it's sort of harder to identify a magical career, but I just recently came across a thing while sorting some papers from my parents, of all things, that, my mom had saved this interaction that she had with one of my favorite writers. She wrote to one of my favorite writers
Hmm.
and said, I have to go bring Andrew in because he's wandering around in the backyard waving a magic staff at the birds. So, apparently I've been
Yeah,
at this for a while.
yeah.
And I was a school teacher for about 20 years. I left school teaching to start a consulting program. That didn't quite take off. So I started sewing clothes and garments and things for people in my social orbit that needed sewn things made. That didn't really take off. I started becoming an astrologer and I started writing an astrology column about 6 years ago. That
Hmm.
did take off to my great surprise. So I've been a professional astrologer now for about 6 years. Uh, so I've had a magical career, a mundane career as a middle school teacher, a sort of short-lived career as a professional STEM consultant, and I've been a hobbyist and a poet for a long, long time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, going back to that story of your mom recounting your adventures, like what's your memory of what you would now consider maybe magical or magical adjacent behaviors? Or I mean, to be a poet, to me it's like you're kind of in a magical world if you think poetically or express poetically. It's like it's just an expression of an experience. And I guess what we're kind of going to talk about today is your alternate definition of what magic is, because it's a word that gets thrown around just kind of for with many different definitions, and it was hard to decide. Okay, well, someone asked me what magic is. How do I land on one? So I was glad that you had kind of a specific one. That
Yeah.
aside, can you talk just a little bit about your experience as a child up to now, like how you view the world and how you think magic has maybe informed that, or maybe the lens that you've looked through?
Sure. You know, kids do all sorts of weird and stupid things or strange things based on experiences in early childhood.
Hmm.
And I found this letter of me waving a magic staff around in the backyard. I was probably about 10. I've spent the last month in the neighborhood that I grew up in from the time that I was 10 until I went away to college. So that's 10 to 18 or so.
Hmm.
And, I'm wandering around and I'm going, oh, that's where my friend Mike lived, and that's where my friend Neil lived, and that's where Eric and Billy lived, and all these various people that I grew up with. And, here's John, and here's where Heather, my first girlfriend, lived, and so on. And I'm also remembering going trick-or-treating in this neighborhood dressed as a wizard.
Hmm.
Like that I wasn't interested in being a soldier or Superman or a monster of any kind. Like I wanted to be a wizard when I went out for Halloween.
Yeah.
And I'm rooting around in my parents' tool room slash, workshop space where I remember my dad repairing lamps and such. and doing minor fix-it-up tasks and where the laundry room is.
Mm.
And I'm remembering, oh yeah, I used these tools to make an Ark of the Covenant when I was like 12. Like, what kid does that? What
Yeah.
kid
Yeah.
goes to church and hears a story about the Ark of the Covenant or watches the Indiana Jones movie
Hmm.
and goes, ah, I want to build an Ark of the Covenant. And
Yeah, you like singularly like went down to like the most magical talismanic piece that you could
yeah,
find. Yeah.
yeah. And,
Yeah.
i- is it cultural appropriation in modern terms? Yes. At the time, it was sort of more like cultural appreciation. Like,
Hmm.
I'm going to build a box
Hmm.
and I'm going to treat this box as sacred and I'm going to enlist a couple of neighborhood kids to carry it around in the backyard because that's what you do with an
Yeah.
ark, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's sort of this ongoing experimentation with taking materials and turning them into stuff
Mm.
and then treating them as relevant.
Mm.
I'm unusual amongst magicians, perhaps, in that I went to seminary.
Mm.
So I went to a good Episcopalian school, as they say, uh, and got a pretty thorough education. I wound up not becoming an Episcopal priest, which is probably good for everybody involved, including the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
But one of my professors there, he's now dead, was a guy by the name of Bishop Mark, and he was very fond of saying that um, all ritual actions are functional in origin, but ontological upon reflection.
Mm.
That is to say, you do something because it has practical purposes or there are practical reasons for doing it.
Right.
Brushing your teeth is a ritual action, right? We do it over and over and over again. And when you think about it, you go, well, an infection in your teeth can spread to your brain, it can spread to your lungs, it can spread to your heart, it can really make you sick. And there's something ceremonial about maintaining your personal health by brushing your teeth.
Right.
Washing your hands between handling incense and handling sacred vessels on the altar during the Eucharist also has a, a practical function, right? You don't want to get sticky frankincense
Mm.
resin onto silver or silver gilt objects because the stickiness will pull the gilt off of the object, and if it's silver plate it will ruin the silver plate and you'll see the base metal underneath and it will no
Hmm.
longer be beautiful.
Yeah.
There are functional reasons for washing your hands, but it also has, when you think about it, a spiritual context of I have handled base matter and now I am
Mm.
prepared to do the sacred operation of turning bread and wine into body and blood of Christ.
Right.
Like I dare not do that with unclean hands. I am going to hold my fingers over this bowl and some poor altar boy is going to have to pour water over them and then I'm going to get this linen napkin dirty in order to wash my hands before I handle the sacred vessels and do the magical operation, right?
Hmm.
So there's something really powerful about that. And here I am talking about this Ark of the Covenant. That's a ritual action. It was totally impractical in the sense that, we didn't actually put the tablets into the Ark. We didn't
Right.
use it like it was for us, it was an adventure piece because we
Hmm.
were we were playing around with this stupid thing in the backyard, pretending to be Indiana Jones in Egypt instead of in suburbia.
Hmm.
But when I think about it, like there is that process of taking ordinary base materials and turning them into something sacred, something uh, deeply powerful and strange and alien that is a way for the divine to connect to earth.
Yeah.
And I think that may be a good place to introduce where we decided to start this conversation, right? Which is what's the definition of magic? And the one that gets circulated a lot, I think, comes out of Aleister Crowley, which is the art of causing change in accordance with will.
Mm-hmm.
Jason Miller has altered this a little bit for his own purposes, which is the art of causing changes in consciousness in
Right.
accordance with will. And given his jailbroken Buddhist background, I think that makes a lot of sense. The one, though, that I approached you with was this one. Um, Magic is the art of operationalizing your worldview. And operationalizing is a term that has been in the news recently because of this secret signals text
Mm-hmm.
message amongst all of these political appointees in the
Mm-hmm.
Defense Department and the intelligence agencies, where we where we have a plan for what we want to do, and we are going to put those plans into operation. We are going to operationalize our worldview. Our worldview is that Europe doesn't pay its fair share, the Middle East doesn't pay its fair share, so we're going to keep the sea lanes open, but we're going to expect something in return for doing this, and we're going to make some kind of trade for our navy and air operations in exchange for concessions around the things that we want.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what this was, is we are going to put into operation what our worldview is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that helps change it from the art of causing change in accordance with will to you have a worldview. Your worldview is that if you make a physical thing, that making that physical thing has a non-local effect on your world. Like
Hmm.
you make a talisman and good things happen because you have chosen to make a talisman or an amulet. I I'll hold this up. I don't know if it will come across, but this is a little sculpture of a bear that I've
Mm-hmm.
made. And you see this red down at the bottom?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to hold it up because it's a seal. And I don't necessarily want to expose the seal to common view because then it can be reproduced, right?
Yeah.
But it's still a seal.
Mm-hmm.
The owl is the same, right? It's a little, yeah, it's very hard to show, but
Oh,
it's a
I
little
see. Yeah.
sculpture of an owl or a bird of prey of some kind. And I believe that if I put my seal and my signature on magical papers, that it's authorizing them from my perspective. So I operationalize my worldview by making stamps and seals to use on my formal magical documents.
Well, do you think that the intent behind it creates the or invites the magic in? Because operationalizing your worldview, if your intent is non-magical, it can still have magical consequences,
That
right?
is correct, right? And like belief is certainly part of it. If you,
Mm-hmm.
I was reading an article before we began about how in Ireland and in Norway and in the Scandinavian countries generally, nobody believes in trolls, nobody believes in fairies, nobody believes in spirit beings or little folk that inhabit the landscape. But if you say, well, we would like to build a road and it requires us to cut down this fairy tree or it requires us to move this fairy rock, people say, absolutely not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, that is a bad idea. Please do not do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and the article went on to to compare that conversation about fairies with the question of whether or not it is a good idea to go searching for ghosts in a cemetery or a hospital.
Mm.
And the conversation revolved around, well, there are more ghosts in hospitals because more people die violent deaths or death under challenging circumstances in hospitals than in graveyards.
Right.
But hospitals are very busy, bright places, and it is easier to find ghosts in dark and lonely places. So it is a whole lot easier to find ghosts in cemeteries.
Hmm.
And this is what makes abandoned hospitals so unbelievably scary, right?
Right.
Because the
Yeah.
ghosts are still there, but it's dark and lonely and abandoned. And therefore, that's the place where you go to find
Huh.
ghosts. So from a magical perspective, that's operationalizing a worldview. If you
Mm-hmm.
want to go talk to ghosts, go to an abandoned hospital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you're talking about the fairy tree or the hawthorn trees, there was a book. I think it was Fluke that I just read, and there was a like an astrophysicist that had a horseshoe above his front door, and one of his colleagues saw it and like pointed it out. Was like, "Do you believe in that stuff?" And he said, "No, but I've heard that it works for people that don't believe it either." And I like that
Yeah.
idea of like you're not going to cut down the hawthorn tree even if you don't believe that the fairies are there, but you it's like adjacently. But if it works, then I don't want to disrupt anything that that maybe I don't know about, even if I'm dogmatic about what belief is and what superstition is. What is it? I'm not superstitious, but I'm a little stitious.
Yes. Yes. And this is relevant to the conversation. Hang on, I'm gonna God, figuring out how to do this.
Oh,
I'm
I
I'm
see
just
it.
gonna have to we're just gonna have to unblur my background and people will see what a disaster my space is.
No, look at this. So what is that?
So this is a uh, this is a periodic table of the elements from a very early printed manuscript describing elemental air, elemental earth, elemental fire, elemental water contained within the ether.
Hmm.
And you might think, well, Andrew, do you really believe in that? And the answer is yes, in complicated ways. But even more importantly, this is an ancestral piece. This sat on my grandfather's desk for
Hmm.
63 years, and I
Wow.
inherited it when he died. He was an MIT trained chemist, and
Hmm.
he thought this was more valuable to his career as a chemist
Hmm.
than the official periodic table that gets published today in chemistry books. Why? Why
Yeah.
why did this prove to be so valuable to him? Because there were only four things that he could do to any chemical process, right? He could apply heat to a bunch of materials and see what happened. That is
Mm-hmm.
to say, he could involve fire. He could apply wet heat by bathing it in a heated bath of some kind containing some kind of liquid, or he could do dry heat and roast it in an oven. He could cool it down by bathing it in cold liquid and circulating liquid over it. He could bathe it in air, basically,
Mm-hmm.
so that materials condensed after they had been formed into gases or steam. Like, so whenever he was thinking about it, yes, he was interested in what the actual chemical properties were of carbon or of copper or whatever material he was working with. But he also had to realize that there was a relatively limited number of things that he, as a chemist trained in the late 1920s, could do to any material.
Mm-hmm.
And that most of those methodologies had already been discovered by the 1300s,
Hmm.
right? He didn't have access to something like a Large Hadron Collider
Right. Yeah.
uh, or CERN or something like that. All he could do was think, I can grind it up. I can make it into more fine and powdery earth. I can roast it. I can boil it. I can steam it. I can run cold air over it or hot air to it and see what happens. And not
Yeah.
much else.
Yeah.
So there's that operationalizing of worldview again, even in as rigorous a discipline as chemistry.
Mm-hmm. But I like that it's kind of captured in just a single image. I talked with another astrologer last week about just the potency of images and how much just a single image, like a sigil or a talisman, can convey so much and continue to convey depending on the the intention behind the creation of the image. I think of just the thema mundi as a chart and how much it teaches continuously from just a single chart. And I like that image like saturated your grandfather's memory to some extent, that kind of was able to be, given to you, that image isn't just those elements, but is also just the memories that you have in relation to it, which like like makes that image even more potent.
Right. It's it's now been more or less in continuous use
Mm-hmm.
for 60 years,
Yeah.
70 years.
Yeah.
My 30-year career passed when I inherited it, plus his own 80-year lifespan plus.
Mm-hmm.
He lived to be 94, but he probably didn't acquire the image right away.
Right. Right. At birth. That was on
But
the back of his birth certificate. Yeah.
somebody gave it to him,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's an old style black and white photograph. I haven't been able to locate what manuscript it came from,
Mm-hmm.
but somebody cleaned it up and turned it into a photograph and gave it to him in when he arrived at MIT to study chemistry in the fall of 1929. The family
Wow.
couldn't afford to send him once the Great Depression ended. So
Mm-hmm.
he had, September, October, November, December, maybe January of a career at MIT. And talk about operationalizing a worldview. That one semester of chemistry was enough to keep him employed for the rest of his life.
Wow. That was 94 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's an extraordinary career based on one semester of college. And now we
Mm-hmm.
say, well, you have to have 4 years of college and you have to have 2 years of graduate school and maybe an additional certificate or three before you can really think about having a career.
Mm-hmm.
Like the nature of our society has changed a lot in those 94 years.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is that people keep expecting more and more images and certificates
Mm.
of excellence,
Validation. Yeah.
validation, right?
Yeah.
And that is itself a kind of
It's
opera
hard to say.
operationalization of worldview,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that is the worldview that is being imposed by the quote unquote ruling class.
Yeah.
There was a great story, I think I saw it on Blue Sky, about the guy who invented a particular programming language 4 or 5 years ago, and he got a hit for somebody to come and apply for this job, and we are looking for somebody who's got 8 years of experience in this programming language. And he's like, I invented it. I'm the guy who created this language,
Yeah.
but it's only 6 years old. You can't
Right. Yeah.
you can't ask for that much experience.
Well, I mean, it represents like kind of uh the expectation of consistent flow and growth without accepting that flow only comes from the ebb that also existed. It's not separate at all. They are in response and connection to each other. But the expectation and the validation of flow is given. But when ebb happens, and we do it, we self-impose it too, of doubt and depression, and it's like the dopamine drops when we have ebbs. Not always, learning how to appreciate and validate the ebb as a part of the same wave cycle. The water current of the flow comes from the ebb, but in a current world where information and speed exponentially are growing without restraint, then we expect that. So we're all participating in that
Operationalized worldview,
operationalized
right?
worldview. We're all feeding into that. We're feeding into that expectation of consistent flow, including the barnacles that you kind of have to have attached to you through certificate after certificate after certificate to validate the educational experience. Just because you go through it does not mean that you have internalized it or can utilize it,
My
by getting the certificate even.
And yet all sorts of beautiful and lovely things depend upon the ebb as well as the flow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my aunt and uncle have lived in the same house on Cape Cod for roughly 60 years now. They've been married for like 61 years, and the only reason that they've they haven't lived in the same house for 61 years is that my uncle hadn't finished building it yet.
Mm,
But part of the reason why they live on Cape Cod is that he has access to the tidal marshes around their house
mm-hmm,
as an oyster collector.
mm,
And if you do not let the tide go out, if you expect the tide to only grow, one, you never get oysters, and
mm-hmm,
two, there's no cape because the sea level has risen so high that the whole place is now underwater and washed away,
mm-hmm.
right? That that ebb and flow is the nature of nature, that
Yeah.
things are supposed to happen in both growth and retreat, growth and increase against retreat and decline. And
Mm,
it's kind of the way that we talk about how Saturn bats last,
mm,
right? Nature bats last in astrology because Saturn takes 30 years to go around. And most of us as human beings will be very lucky to see three Saturn cycles,
mm-hmm.
90 years.
Yeah.
Very, very few people get four. I'm not
Yeah.
sure there is anybody who's documented to have lived four Saturn cycles, which would be what, 120 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Certainly don't get five.
Right. Maybe some biblical character, but their timing is was a little fuzzy.
Their timing is a little bit fuzzy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I like that idea of using oysters as a example, like a twice a day example of the need for the tide to go out. I grew up on tidal marshes, but just in the South. And so when the tides would go out, me and the neighborhood kids would run through the marsh grasses that I, as an adult, understand were batted down by the alligators. So, one, I think that there's magical protection of all children to a certain degree when it comes to nature, because we would run the labyrinth maze of the marsh grasses when the water would go out, and we would catch fiddler crabs and we would get cattails to blow up on our hands. We would use those, but we could not do that when the water came in because the water would also bring in the alligators.
oh
Um,
my God,
but
yes.
but the experience of having that very temporal playground only existed because the water would leave twice a day. And
Right.
we knew to read the tides as the summer went on, to know when we could go do that. And, at I don't think that all of us don't appreciate ebb. I think that even just having the conversation, so we appreciate rest, and when we don't have a billion things to do and we don't have things on our calendar, and the more we flow, I think that we're seeking that ebb. We're seeking the silence and the spaces that ebb comes. But the idea of points and tension, uh, I've talked about this recently with other astrologers, of just talking about nodal axis and, like, looking at the north and south node regardless of signs, and how, like, they operate with each other. They do not operate one end of the other. That the north node is not always good and the south node is not always bad, but that they kind of, their points of movement, and that tension point is, it reminds me of fabric. And I like that you sew and you work with fabric, because the warp and the weft of fabric only exists because there's tension, and you
Right.
have to have like a billion crossroads that weave fabric and weave it together to hold form, right?
You not only need that, but here's a piece of fabric, right? And it's cut in such a way that it's mostly stiff in one direction and
Mm,
it's mostly stiff in the other direction. And if you pull it even slightly on the diagonal, it
mm,
stretches enormously. And we call
mm-hmm,
that the bias.
mm-hmm,
If you're playing with fabric on a 45-degree angle, it's got a whole lot more stretch to it than you would really expect. And it's that, again, some pieces of our worldview are factual.
mm,
If you've got a fabric that's made of threads, warp and weft, the 90-degree angles are going to pull a lot less and
mm,
allow for a whole lot less flexibility than the 45-degree angle,
mm,
simply because crossroads only allow for a certain amount of movement in one direction or another. But
mm-hmm,
if you treat if you treat the angles as relevant, suddenly you've got pedestrians in the crosswalks and they're
Yeah.
cutting across the intersection on the diagonal
Hmm.
because it's shorter. And if you allow pedestrians to cross either at the 90-degree or at the 45, you can actually shorten the amount of time that the light
Hmm.
is red or green in any one direction.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to allow for that 45-degree motion, and it creates excitement and interest, and powerful crossroads build up at those kinds of places.
Yeah. I saw a visual it was a visual story of just that, of like major intersections of for vehicles, and then showing the pedestrian pattern and the pathways that pedestrians just forged themselves around it, because you had this concrete, like determined, dangerous, fast, uncomfortable, probably hotter crossroads, but then these beautiful natural patterns that the pedestrians just from foot traffic would create, and they were all at like these 45-degree angles. It's yeah.
Right? So again, some pieces of our worldview are factual. They are based
Mhm.
on natural processes, and some of them are cultural,
Mm.
right? This tree is inhabited by fairies. That rock is inhabited by trolls. We don't believe in fairies or trolls, but God help us if we move them,
Mm. Mhm.
right? There's a cultural aspect to those things that says don't do certain kinds of things to the landscape, or do certain kinds of things because the landscape will respond favorably to you doing them.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if when you talked about wiping your hands between dealing with resinous incense and grabbing, a gilded chalice, the story is you cleanse your hands. It's not the practicality. It's not you're going to ruin this, this artifact that the church members have donated and tithe to purchase. Like that's kind of cold. That is factual. But the story is like you cleanse the process. There's a proper order to things, and you cleanse it. And to me, the story reminds me of the visual. There's so much more that's taught through the story. It's easier to remember, for one thing, that there is this ritual, and the ritual is kind of told in a more poetic or mythopoetic way than just giving you a list of instruction. And to me, that thread or that current feels like the magical current that is adjacent to the factual instructional piece of it. Does that make sense?
It does, right? There are perfectly good reasons why you would want to touch a common communion vessel that everybody in the congregation is going to drink out of. Like, wash your hands before you go out and you perform a ceremony for
Mm-hmm.
400 people and give them all communion, because you don't want to be a vector for disease. You don't
Right.
want you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But treating it as part of the process of becoming holy yourself, or holier than normal, so that you can properly deliver the quality that is needed to the congregation as part of their experience of the holy, that matters, right?
Yeah.
And I thought about this a little bit when I chose my tea mug, which says love
Mm-hmm.
on it, right? I would like for your listeners and watchers to have the experience that part of my worldview is that loving other people is important,
Mm-hmm.
right? So how do I do that? By choosing the mug that says this rather than the one that has a rude expression on
Right.
it.
Knowing, yeah, naming it. And I just have to back up. I love holier than normal as a phrase. I think that that's great. I just, to me, it also speaks to that choosing love as the subversive or outright expression of what you're trying to convey to people that, you're not necessarily seeing, but are witnessing this or hearing this. To be holier than normal, to act with a bit more intention or sacred push, to me is bringing in kind of that love current.
Right. And it's also possible to bring in other currents, because if your worldview is, I should screw with people as much as possible for my own benefit, and
Mm-hmm.
we certainly have a sense of what happens in the world when we do that.
Hmm.
We see examples of that every day. If that is our worldview and that is the worldview that we choose to enact in the world, that's a kind of magic too. And it's
Hmm.
a highly malefic magic that not only affects the people that we choose to do it to, but it also has an effect on us.
Indeed.
And it's hard to get across that point because we live in a world that is filled with magical images. Those
Mm.
magical images include things as diverse as the McDonald's arches or uh, the Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks logo that says, this is the place where you get caffeinated and this is the place where you're going to eat sugar donuts and we want you to love us.
Hmm.
Uh, for reasons of our own profitability, and we probably won't poison you.
Right. So
Probably.
one of my experiences with being around people that I witnessed were doing deliberately doing that on a personal level of, to me it was playing with powers that were way bigger than they were. They were voluntarily participating in it to do harm to other people. And I was in my 20s and I didn't know a lot, but I knew that that was wrong. And I was honestly scared to just be around them because I felt like they were inviting, they were negotiating with things that were more powerful than we were because we were young, and that they were going to cause them harm. And I didn't want any collateral damage, just even just being in their vicinity. I thought about that recently, that just that whole story, and wanted to ask you about just and maybe that's why the high priestess kind of came up when I was thinking about this. I pulled the high priestess and magician card up before this about the power of gatekeeping and um, initiation and protection and doing things in the right order, washing your hands proverbially and literally when doing this kind of work. So, can you just speak about that? And if you've had those experiences yourself, or advice that you give to people that are curious about the negotiations themselves?
Sure. Um, I have done a fair bit of work with the magical operation that usually goes by the name DSIC in online discussions today, drawing spirits into crystals. I think it
Mm,
was originally published by Francis Barrett in 1803 or 1804, something like that, in English.
mm,
And he claimed that he had access to a manuscript created by Abbot Johann Trithemius of Sponheim, who was the Roman Catholic Benedictine abbot of a place in Germany called Sponheim. And he was the teacher of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who wrote 3 books of occult philosophy.
mhm,
And Agrippa dedicated 3 books to him. So I'm not sure that anybody actually has seen Francis Barrett's Trithemius manuscript, but people call it sometimes the Trithemius operation.
mm,
You've got a disc, you've got a uh, a small crystal ball on top of the disc, which is engraved with the names of archangels and angels. You light some candles, uh, you perform a bunch of prayers, and you call an angel or a spirit into the crystal, and then you talk to the crystal as if that being is inside of the crystal.
mhm,
Well, it's a very peculiar thing. You do this kind of ritual, you do this magical operation, and you think nothing is going to happen, and then you see eyes staring out of the crystal back at you.
mm,
Okay, they're just the reflected candle light passing through the imperfections and flaws inside of the crystal,
mhm,
but there's still this very freaky, weird experience of seeing eyes staring back at you out of the crystal.
mhm,
And you do this enough times, and gradually it becomes easier and easier and easier to decide that it's not actually candle flame. It becomes easier to feel like you're actually talking to an entity inside of the crystal. And after a while, it's really, really hard to believe that it is just firelight, that it is
Mhm.
just candlelight. And then one day you realize, actually, I'm not just talking to myself and talking to the crystal. I'm talking to a thing that is inside the crystal that is looking back at me.
Mm.
And then, 3 or 4 weeks later, 5 weeks, 10 weeks later, I forget how long it was, I was talking with a friend of mine and he said, I don't believe that's actually possible. And I grabbed the salt shaker off the table in this restaurant and I poured a little bit of salt onto the table and I said, Raphael, can you be here in these salt crystals and show my friend that you're really here? And my friend freaked out because he was suddenly faced with an angel in a
Mm.
brightly lit daytime restaurant.
Mhm.
Holy shit. Like, it's not just my experience, it's also his experience. It's
Mm.
also the experience of the other person in a crowded restaurant, that there is a real entity that is looking back at me out of some spilled salt on a table.
Mm.
Uh, Like, that should not happen. Is it my confidence in the operation that has made it possible for my friend to experience being face to face with an angel that's in this tiny little bit of salt on the table? Or is my confidence in my magical skills enough for that to happen? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's, but on the other hand, you talk to an angel or you talk to a diamond or a spirit that's inside of a crystal like that, and there are real limits on what they're capable of doing for you.
Mhm.
For one thing, they don't really seem to be interested in owning your soul. Um, for another, you know, you talk to, for example, Sabnok, who's a spirit I've worked with a fair bit on behalf of other people to find people housing.
Mm.
And they're not interested, Sabnok does not seem to be interested in kicking people out of homes in order to put you into them.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, they do seem to be really interested in hooking up people who need houses with fairly precise sets of conditions attached to them with empty residences.
Mm.
And if it's convenient, yeah, they'll make that happen.
Yeah.
Um, but in one case, I was helping somebody find a place to live, and they needed a really, really highly specific set of conditions. And they got all of the things that they asked for, but they also got a broken roof.
Mm.
Like, Sabnok is like, this is the best that I can do. I'm sorry. You will have to figure out how to get the roof repaired in order to be able to live here. And
Yeah.
the people that I found this house for were like, well, this is annoying, but it meets all of our other conditions, so sure,
Mhm.
this is
Yeah.
where we'll live.
Well, it's like all the other conditions were met, so they didn't have to worry or consider them. There was
Right.
this other condition that they didn't know they needed to specify.
And it was the same with my house. We mentioned before that we were talking about, the fact that we moved into this house in 2021 between Delta and Omicron. We got
Mm.
married sort of at the same time, my wife and I. And we desperately needed to have a place to live, and there was no housing to be found. And I did the Sabnok right. And as it so happened, we found a house that had just gone off the market because it had a burst water pipe.
Mm.
So we were in the house for a couple of days and I was trying to get ourselves ready. And I actually forgot to make the agreed upon offering to Sabnok for in Thanksgiving for the house, and the pipes froze. So we
Mm.
were just about to have this disaster happen to us that had happened to the the guy who'd put it on the market but wasn't living here.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh shit. And I went out and I bought a couple of steaks and I cut them up raw into a bunch of pieces and I tossed them around in the woods and at the nearby crossroads and the pipes unfroze.
Yeah. Like that was close.
That was really close. Thank you for not ruining my day. Thank you
Yeah.
for not ruining my new house. But
Mm-hmm.
but it is kind of a reminder that you're we're engaging in bargaining and negotiation if that's part of our worldview. And
Mm.
it is definitely part of my worldview that I live in a world that is absolutely teeming with intelligences and entities that are not human, but nonetheless have an interest in living in negotiated relationships with us. And since we've sort of been ignoring these kinds of treaty obligations, the negotiation has to happen on a one-to-one basis.
Mm.
And your life actually gets better negotiating with the spirits that live in and around your community.
Mm-hmm.
Part of my arrangement is okay, I live in a town where we bus a huge number of kids to a regional school because we don't have enough kids of our own to run a school system of our own. Certainly not past fifth or sixth grade at the moment, and probably never into high school. So we participate, and it's like, okay, yeah, you got to serve on the library board for your town. You've got to serve on the school committee for your town. Uh, If I believe in democracy, if that's part of my worldview, then I
Mm.
have to be prepared to be part of the government of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Mm-hmm.
Like part of my worldview is that we're embedded in a web of mutual obligations with other spirits. Damn it, that also includes participating in local government.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, it may involve participating in regional governments or
Yeah.
higher, and learning to respect the opinions of people who also serve, but who have different worldviews than mine.
Do you think that
Damn it.
this do you think that like you are exploring or playing around with just saying this out loud of what your definition of magic is, but your life work and all of the diverse ways that you have participated also kind of says this, like your worldview of participating in making talismanic things, including an Ark of the Covenant at 10 years old, or sewing, or I on your website you or your blog you had like bookbinding, and you do all sorts of different consultations. You work with natural magic, but it's diversified. It's not just singularly one thread of astrology or Tai Chi. It's diversified, and to me that kind of shows that you have been kind of doing this in many different ways, including doing social engagement of being volunteering with local community and local political things. So, is it just have you clarified this for yourself, or are you threading it together from a life work?
Well, it comes back to Bishop Mark's thing, right? All ritual actions are functional in origin, but ontological upon reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting that you pulled the magician card because uh, a friend of ours embroidered two beautiful representations of two tarot cards for us. And the two tarot cards that hang above our mantelpiece, one for my wife, one for me, are the high priestess for her
Really?
and the Hierophant for me,
Mm,
right? That okay,
the high priest.
I am not a genuine and authorized pope of the Discordian church, but I might be.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, but on the other hand, there is this essential quality of recognizing that the work of our hands in the world, and not simply the work of our minds as magicians and as astrologers, actually matters to the quality of the life that we lead. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to sit on the sidelines and be a critic of the work, and the real work involves making things and doing things and participating in life while also believing that all of that work has to be suffused with spiritual intention. Like
Hmm.
I kind of believe in the idea of theurgy from the Neoplatonic school of the second and third centuries, that part of what we're here to do is to make ourselves divine or to be divine like. And if I
Hmm.
believe that, then part of my job is to bring love and beauty into the world, like to live out the expectations of Venus in my chart, to be a high quality communicator, to live out the experience of Mercury in my chart, to be a generous leader, to live out the experience of Jupiter in my chart, to be a rational but also an emotionally invested human being, to live out my sun and moon, to know how to have a healthy body, to live my ascendant, and ultimately to recognize that as a human being, I am bound to die. And for my material body and even the things that I make eventually to go away and to live out my Saturn experience. Like we are the fuel that becomes the next generation of life or the one after that or the one after that.
Hmm.
And if my poetry survives me, if some of the sewn things that I've made survive me, great. But eventually, they're all made of organic materials. They're going to return to Earth sooner or later.
Yeah.
And I will be forgotten and perish from the world, both in memory and in reality. And
Hmm.
that's normal.
Yeah.
I mean, infinite growth is the logic of cancer.
Hmm.
And uh, and I my goal is not to be a cancer on the world, but to leave behind useful byproduct.
Yeah. So I'm going to share this. So before the call, I wanted to, I just wanted to have two images, and these are the ones that came through, and the magician and the high priestess came through. And I think the high priestess came through because I was thinking about the potency of engaging in negotiations with entities and magical spirits, and understanding the law of boundaries and thresholds and the responsibility that the high priestess has. But then the magician, um, as card one, and after the fool, it's the magician and then the high priestess. But all of the elements on the table and just recirculating those elements, energy is not created or destroyed, but just changes form. And similar to like what you were saying about, the beauty that we do have a contained temporal experience, both in living as an animal and memory, that energy, the creation, the ideas, if they do survive, just transform and get composted and reborn into something new. To me, feels like the magician, but that it's sub rosa, it's under the cloak of mystery with the roses above him. um, so yeah, if I were to give you it would not be the the hierophant, the high priest. I think it would be the magician, but that's my choice. Maybe it's um oh, did I lose you? And we're back.
Yeah, I don't know what happened, but I live out in the boonies, so we
Yeah,
probably lost local internet.
yeah, yeah, it happens. I'm glad that we get to kind of wrap it up and finish off, because I wanted to just thank you to your face for joining the conversation. Not
Well, it was
just,
a delightful conversation. I mean,
yeah,
this is one of those things that we all should be thinking about. Like, what is our underlying assumption about why this stuff works? Because
yeah,
it clearly does work. What what are the reasons for that?
yeah, yeah. And I think it helps when there are questions out there of like, that shouldn't have happened. I had this instance where my GPS told me to get off the highway, and I did, but then I second guessed of like, but I've driven this route home. It's a 10-hour route from one family member to another. This is not the exit. And as soon as I get off, I slow down enough to see that my truck is just billowing with smoke. And it's like, how did my GPS know to tell me to get off? It's like all the other signals I was missing, but I followed it. And then I, was saved of being stranded on the interstate. I was just stranded at a mechanic's, that was right off the interstate. It's like, how does that work? I just think that reconciling things that don't make sense, putting them in a framework that maybe makes a little bit of sense, under the umbrella of protection or angels or magic or things beyond me, whatever they might be.
Yeah, and also that all things that live and move and have their being in the world of generation and decay,
Mm,
right? Everything that exists within the cosmos has some kind of living entity associated with it.
mm.
My story is that our family's 1956 Dodge Rambler died directly outside of a junkyard on a very hot summer day. But it's the same kind of thing. Like
Yeah.
things things naturally come to their natural resting place
Mm,
sometimes through no agency of ours,
yeah.
but they sort of know when their time is up, and they give up their ghost.
Yeah.
They literally give
Yeah.
up their spirit, and the
Yeah.
spirit says, "Yeah, I'm done inhabiting this. You can have this back and
Hmm.
return it to the material world."
The scrapyard. Well, yeah, just thanks for the conversation. And it was really a delight to kind of have an excuse to just hang out with you and talk to you. But I would like for you to do some self promotion of just telling people how they can engage with you on a professional level and the services that you offer and what you would like to share about yourself.
Sure. I've been keeping a blog in one form or another. Nearly the entire archive of what I've written online is at andrewbwatt.com going back to 2002. I've been writing on that specific website since 2009, but I imported everything that I wrote before. So you can go back to my very early poetic career and read the trash that I was writing at the beginning. And my teaching career is up there, particularly the years when I ran a design lab at a school. I was there. Um, and I've been writing a astrology column there for the last 6 years. The new column comes out roughly plus or minus a couple of days. It comes out roughly on the 1st, the 10th, and the 20th of every month. Sometimes it's a couple of days early. I have been on time for every single sun's entry to a new decan since I started writing the column, which I'm pretty proud of.
You should be very proud of that.
6 years. It'll be
Yeah.
6 years at Leo 1.
Yeah.
So that's probably the best way to find me is to use the feedback form or the contact me form, which is there's a link at the top of the page.
Hmm.
You can also interact with me on Blue Sky, where I'm Andrew B. Watt. And I'm sort of not as active on Twitter these days. Those are probably the best ways to get a hold of me, really, is through Blue Sky or through my own website. And the big thing that I'm doing in the near future is that the Organization of Professional Astrologers is doing a summit for astrologers on learning how to be in the business of astrology because it is a business.
Hmm.
And the primary thing that I do these days is do natal consultations and solar return consultations and other forms of astrological consultation. And I'm one of the presenters at this conference. I'm going to be talking about how to be an effective speaker
Hmm.
of astrological information to different kinds of audiences and how to develop a quality presentation based on who you know you're going to be talking to.
Nice.
And I'm
Yeah.
the second presenter, so that'll be interesting.
Wow. Yeah, I signed up for that when I saw that. The panel looked amazing, and I love the business of astrology. I think it's something that people kind of shy away from because they hold the practice pretty sacred, but the exchange of money is also part of that practice. It shows value and it shows the appreciation of the work that goes into it. And the exchange, I feel like, is a vital piece of it. So I'm glad just to see the entire conference come together.
Yeah, I'm excited to find out how other people think about this. I
Mm,
mean, I spent 6 or 7 years working for SCORE, which is score.org, and it's a
mm,
volunteer agency that used to run out of the Small Business Administration of the United States government.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that we provided advice to people who were starting up small businesses and gave them guidance on developing a business plan and a marketing plan. I got a lot out of it in terms of being able to advise my own clients
Mm.
about how to do that kind of thing and whether or not there was something in their chart that said you should be looking at creating a side hustle. And here's some actual real world resources on how to do that.
Yeah.
But, for every time that I taught somebody how to do that, I was thinking, okay, how do I apply this kind of knowledge
Mm-hmm.
to my own business?
Yeah.
Because again, writing a business plan is just like writing a sigil. It
Mm.
has that same kind of value to it, except that it's something that you can post above your desk like mine is here
Mm.
and
Mm-hmm.
go, okay, am I on track today? Have I done what I need to do today? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no.
Yeah. Sometimes wait.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll get to that tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I think the big trouble with any of this at the moment is marketing. There are a lot of astrologers out there. We each have I don't want to say that we each have a relatively narrow niche, but it takes time to build up a reliable list of clients that you're sympathetic with
Mm.
and who have the money and the resources to come to you on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have to be working to develop new clients.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's a kind of a challenging business to be in, and I don't think we have a clear sense of what a good business model is for it, particularly in a time of economic downturn like now.
Yeah. I talked with a couple of astrologers yesterday about this, and I think that there's like a formula that people try to replicate because they've seen it work for other people. But I inherently kind of distrust formulas, and I want to see them um, develop for the individual. And so, what came down to it as I was talking, and a lot of it was saying it out loud to myself as much as them, as if you do this for joy, joy needs to be the center and the heart of all that you do with it. And you have to really enjoy it, because if you don't enjoy it, it will come through. You don't have to enjoy everything at all times, but fundamentally, you'll find your niche when you find what you really enjoy, and you just stay there. And you will have reciprocal currents that come back to you if you always operate within that heart-centered space of joy. Joy is my
Yeah,
middle name, so I'm partial to the concept of joy.
excellent. The other side of that is the position of one of my ex-girlfriends who was a longtime tarot reader. And she eventually got out of the business in part because she said, I got tired of being asked to give people permission for doing dumb things.
Hmm.
Like eh, my I feel like the best work that I do as an astrologer comes when the first session is them coming to me because they feel like they have a crisis and they think I can solve their problems.
Hmm.
I give them advice. The second time that I see them, their life is in a much better place. They're looking to tweak some things about their life that don't seem to be working well. So it's no longer crisis. It's how do I adjust
Mm.
course? And then the third time, it's my life is firing on all cylinders. How do I go even better than this?
Yeah.
And then it's helping them launch to whatever bigger and better opportunities might be presentable in the chart.
Yeah.
And so far, knock on wood, I haven't had a client come back to me after that third or fourth session going, my life is in crisis again and I need
Let's
to
start
fix
over.
things. So I guess those clients go, I need somebody else other than Andrew.
I mean, that to me is it's a beautiful expression of how astrology can really accelerate. And that was something that I read recently about magic, and how magic in the wrong hands or magic at the wrong time, can do so much self-harm. And if you use astrology or ritual um, to, if you're heading for the rocks and you're asking for the magic to help accelerate you, it doesn't mean that you're going to land on the shore. It means that you're just going to crash faster. And especially Saturn, I find, but all of astrology will help redirect you. And sometimes that can be through that crisis. But using the astrological guidance or the rudder or the currents or the boundaries can help really accelerate. And then you get to catch the waves and catch the currents instead of just paddling. You get to sail a little bit
Yeah.
faster.
I've just read a great book by David Gann. I think this is one of the things that I like about reading outside of the magical and astrological framework.
Mm-hmm.
David Gann's book is called The Wager, and it is about a voyage of a British Navy ship with the George Anson Squadron in 1740. They were tasked with sailing halfway around the world from England to the middle of the Pacific to intercept the annual Acapulco galleon, which sailed from Acapulco to the Philippines carrying Spanish looted treasure from the Aztecs
Wow.
across the Pacific Ocean and then around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa and then back up to Spain with the hope of keeping it out of British or Dutch hands. Like that was
Mm-hmm.
the reason for doing it this way. And the Brits decided that they were going to send a squadron of ships all the way around to intercept this galleon in the middle of the Atlantic or in the middle of the Pacific. And at the time, they had no reliable system of navigation for longitude. They knew how far
Mm.
north or how far south they were on the globe, how far away from the equator, but they could not accurately predict where they were on an east to west course.
Hmm.
And
It
these
seems
guys,
vital.
yeah, these guys, 5,000 men in a flotilla of 7 ships, sailed around the tip of South America. It took them 2.5 months to beat the currents and the waves going
Hmm.
around the southern tip of South America. And by the time they reached uh, the western coast of Chile, the 5 ships were down to 3, and one of them got shipwrecked without ever spotting the other 2. And those guys were marooned for 2.5 years. And nobody on that ship that got shipwrecked, the Wager is the name of the ship, nobody understood that they had to make friends with the local indigenous people in order to survive.
Mm.
The captain kind of understood that, but dealt with the basic problem of racism. And I'm a Brit, and our job is to bring the benefits of civilization to the rest of the world. And the local spirits abandoned them. The local people abandoned them to their fate. Uh, and and of the total crew of about 5,500 men for these 7 ships, something under 300 survived, including just about 60 people from this one shipwreck.
Hmm.
And like we are dependent upon the natural world. We are dependent upon our relationships with the trees that provide us with air and food. We are dependent on the natural landscape to support us with gravity. We are dependent on our microbiomes within us, which are kind of like crew members of the Starship Enterprise as we carry our bodies through an environment that would be very hostile to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like we, we are dependent on so many different forms of life that is both visible and invisible, and yet we act like we're the only ones here.
Yeah.
Operationalize your worldview. Make friends with the spiritual entities on which your life depends,
Mm-hmm.
and your life gets better, and it gets
Yeah.
better in a hurry.
Yeah. I love that. That's a great way to close this out with a charm.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It was really a joy to talk to you.
It
And
was
I'm
a
glad
great
that,
joy to talk to you, Christa, and thank you for the opportunity.
of
I hope to see
course.
you at another Toastmasters meeting sometime soon.
Yes. Yeah. 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 I would love to come back.
Great.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.